My name is Dr. J Cardinell, and each week I teach a small group lesson based on Lifeway's Explore the Bible curriculum. So I'd encourage you to grab your copy of Scripture and join me in Psalm 132. I want you to think with me for a second about promises. How do people give and receive promises? Well, if you're a little kid, you might say, let's pinky promise on that. If you're a grown man, you might say, let's shake on that. If you're getting married and you're promising to be faithful to someone, you might exchange rings or a vow. You see, promises can be verbal, they can be written, they can be implied. Promises are important in the way we live our lives. Well, in Psalm 132, we're going to see some promises. God's going to make two promises. One is going to be fulfilled in David's historical context or right after his context. And then another one's going to be coming much later. It's a messianic promise. You see, we can look at Psalm 132 in three ways. We can understand it based on David's historical context. Like previous Psalms we've looked at, this is a reference to a time in David's life. This psalm is also a song of ascent. Traditionally, this song was sung as people went up to Jerusalem or went up to the temple to worship the Lord. This psalm, as I said, is also messianic. This week and next week, when we look at Psalm 110, we're going to look at some messianic psalms. Psalms that point us forward to Christ. And we can know that when these songs were originally sung by faithful people, they were remembering the promises of God, looking forward way into the future when God was going to fulfill what He said He was going to fulfill. And we can learn through all of this that God faithfully fulfilled His promise to send the Messiah, the Lord's anointed deliverer. And that deliverer was Christ. So join me in Psalm 132, verses 1 through 10. Lord, remember David and all the hardships he endured, and how he swore an oath to the Lord, making a vow to the mighty one of Jacob. I will not enter my house or get into my bed. I will not allow my eyes to sleep or my eyelids to slumber until I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard of the ark in Ephrathah. We found it in the fields of Jar. Let's go to his dwelling place. Let's worship at his footstool. Rise up, Lord. Come to your resting place. You and your powerful ark. May your priests be clothed with righteousness, and may your faithful people shout for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. Now, it's important for us to note that while this psalm references a time in David's life, the psalm was probably written after David lived. It possibly was written after the people of Israel returned from exile and had even built the second temple. So there was no Davidic king on the throne of Israel at this time. The second thing we can note about this psalm, which isn't clear in your personal study guide, is that these 10 verses we just read are actually two stanzas. Verses 1 through 5 are a plea to the Lord based on David's oath to the Lord. And verses 6 through 10 are a remembrance of a historical event during the life of David. Both stanzas reveal that worship is essential for the life of the believer. Now, in verses 1 through 5, the psalmist asked the Lord to remember the hardships of David. Now, David had many hardships in his life. Some were brought on by others, and some were brought on by his bad decisions. But here, the hardships referenced are very specific. They're in reference to David's desire to provide a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. Now, it's necessary here that we review some history from the Old Testament. Now, while we get history throughout the Old Testament, we have 12 books that are designated histories, and they chronicle the time from when Israel entered the land in Joshua all the way through the judges and the kings and the divided kingdom, even into the exile, and then the return of Israel to the land after the exile. And so we have these histories. And one of those history books is the book of 2 Samuel. When we get to 2 Samuel, we find David settled into his kingdom. He's conquered everybody. He's settled down. He's taken Jerusalem from the Jebusites, and it's become his capital. And in the process, David has built himself a palace. And when he's settled into his palace, he has a thought. He says this, "Look, I'm living in a cedar house, while the ark of God sits inside tent curtains." Now, King David is talking to his prophet Nathan when he says this, and David's realizing, he says, "I built myself a place to live, a permanent home to live in, But God's out there in this tent, it seems. God's presence in the ark is out there in this tent, and that's not good. That's not proper for God to be out there. And so I want to worship the Lord by building him a proper temple. Okay, well, that's good and all, but I want you to think for a second. That's David worshiping the Lord through his actions. We normally think of worship through songs or something like that, but David wants to do something to worship the Lord. I want you to stop for a second, and I want you to consider in what ways can we worship the Lord through our actions. Now, while we think of worship as that thing we do on Sunday mornings where we sing songs to the Lord, worship can be much more than that. Worship can be expressed through our acts of service, through our acts of giving, through our act of teaching kids, children, or adults, and through our acts of ministry in the church and even outside the church as we serve folks in our community, as we serve those in need, the less fortunate, those who are in a bad situation, those who just need our help day to day. All of these things can be worship to the Lord. And the Lord makes this clear through the words of James. In James chapter 1, verse 27, the writer says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." The essential element needed to turn our good works or our good acts of service into worship is a proper heart posture. When we do things, good things in the community or in the church in response to what God has done, who God is, the nature of God, these things can become worship. And it's important, though, that we do things for the Lord. We don't just do things to look good in the community. We don't do things just to make ourselves feel good. We're doing these things for the Lord. They're acts of worship. When Paul writes to slaves in Colossae, he expresses the fact that all things should be done unto the Lord. Whatever you do it from the heart as something done for the Lord and not for people. So the psalmist begins in verses 1 through 5, asking the Lord to remember the hardships that David went through to build the temple. Now, we know David didn't complete the temple. God did not let David build the temple. Solomon completed the temple, but David found the location. David began selecting supplies and collecting everything together so Solomon could eventually do the work. So the psalmist says, don't forget what David did, Lord. And then in the next verses, the psalmist is going to turn us to another historical event in the life of David that took place before he even had this desire to build the temple. In 2 Samuel chapter 6, we get the account of David going and getting the Ark of the Covenant. Now, why do you have to go get it? Well, because it had been missing. Since before Saul was even king, before David, during the time of Samuel the prophet, the Ark of the Covenant went missing. It was taken by the Philistines. And eventually it was recovered or given back actually to Israel. But the Israelites in the whole process, they had kind of messed things up. And eventually the Ark of the Covenant didn't make it back to where it should be. Actually, Samuel tells us that it wound up in Kiriath Jearim at Abudad's house on the hill. And the psalmist tells us that they heard of the ark in Ephrathah. And that's another word for Bethlehem. But the psalmist also says they found it in Jar. Well, what does that mean? Well, some say that's just another word, a poetic way of saying Kiriath Jearim. But our Explore the Bible commentary says that that word Jar was never used as a place name. It probably means thicket. And Tony Merida says it this way. They basically found it, the Ark of the Covenant, out in the woods. So we have to ask ourselves, what role did the Ark of the Covenant play in the life of Israel? Well, it was central to Israel's worship. It's the place where God manifested his presence. It manifested God's power in battle. It's the place where the high priest would sprinkle the blood on the Day of Atonement, and it had been missing for 40 years. And David says that it had been totally forgotten. They had neglected it or him, as the CSB says, during the time of Saul. So the missing Ark of the Covenant was a missing central piece to Israel and Israel's worship of the Lord. And again, Tony Merida continues his thought on this. He says, no one seems to miss the ark, this most vital item for worship. No one seems to care that it was somewhere out there in the woods. No one seems to miss this special presence of God. No one seemed to miss the work of atonement. They didn't seem to miss the ark because they didn't miss God. Eugene Peterson paraphrases a verse from First Chronicles, and it kind of helps us understand this. He says the ark was out of sight and out of mind during the time of Saul. I want you to stop and I want you to consider what can cause God to become out of sight and out of mind in the life of a believer. Sin, busyness, self-focus, all kinds of things can cause God to become out of sight and out of mind. And then we can become like the Israelites and not appreciate the lacking of God in our life. We often talk about appreciating the presence of God, but we also need to learn to appreciate when He's not there so that we will look for Him and strive for Him. See, the psalmist is building up towards something here. And he begins with calling on the Lord to remember the work that David did to worship Him, to do things that are an act of worship. And in the process, we can remember that believers should be intentional in their worship of God. The psalmist concludes this passage with another call for the Lord to remember His anointed king, David. But in the next passage, he's going to continue to sing about God's promises and call on God to remember another promise God made. So let's keep trucking. Look at Psalm 132, verses 11 through 14. The Lord swore an oath to David, a promise He will not abandon. I will set one of your offspring on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant, my decrees that I will teach them, their sons will also sit on your throne forever. For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for His home. This is my resting place forever. I will make my home here because I have desired it. So remember, this is a song of ascent. It was sung by people as they came up to the temple to worship the Lord. And it begins by calling out the Lord, saying, God, don't forget the promises you made to David. Don't forget the things that David did for you. And so it's just a reminder and a way of worshiping the Lord. But here in these verses, the psalmist and the singers, they turn their attention to a promise made by God. So let's go back and let's remember the historical context from David's time period. David had built himself a palace. David had desired to build a temple for the Lord. So he goes to Nathan. He says, Nathan, I've got a nice home. Let's build a home for the Lord. Nathan says, sounds like a good idea to me. Let's move forward. Well, that night, the Lord comes to Nathan, the prophet, and the Lord tells Nathan, hold up, we're not going to do that. That's not how things are going to go. And see, he's going to proceed to tell Nathan what to tell David. And what he says to David is, David, you desire to build me a house, but I'm going to build a house for you. I'm going to build a line for you, a family for you to come out of. And in these verses, 11 through 14, we can see God's promise, the condition of God's promise, and the reason for God's promise. So first we have God's promise. God tells David that your son is going to sit on your throne. Now that's a good thing because in the ancient world, you never know if your son's actually going to be able to reign after you. Maybe somebody else is going to try and take over, something like that. But then God goes forward. Not only is your son going to sit on the throne, but your line is going to sit on the throne of Jerusalem forever. Well, that's God's promise. Well, what are the conditions of God's promise? So let's consider what God said. God said that He would never abandon the oath He swore to David. Now that's important, and it will come back to be important later as well. But I want to take a moment. I want you to consider your driver's license. I know it's kind of a funny thing to jump to, but let's consider your driver's license for a moment. Your driver's license gives you the ability, the permission, the rights to take a vehicle that weighs several tons and drive 50, 60, 65, 70 miles an hour down the highway. You have that ability, that right, because your driver's license says you did. But if you continue to maybe break the law, you are driving way too fast, you're driving recklessly, or you're doing something else, that right might be revoked. Your driver's license might be suspended and you can no longer drive anymore. You see, you have this right, you have this promise you can do this thing, but if you don't do the right thing, you lose that ability. Well, when God talks about His conditions for this promise He's made, it's very similar. God said, if your sons and your grandsons, your great-grandsons and your great-great-grandsons, if they keep my law, if they live righteously, they'll sit on the throne. Now, this doesn't mean that just living righteously gives someone the right to sit on the throne. No, it means that God is going to intentionally intervene so that only the righteous descendants of David can sit on that throne. And we know there's a problem coming down the line. Eventually, David's sons and grandsons and great-grandsons, they don't live righteously. And God has to remove them from the throne and eventually remove Israel from the land. So there's a condition to God's promise. God said, I'll keep my promise forever. But you've got a part to play in that as well. So we have God's promise. We have the condition of God's promise. And now we also have the reason for God's promise. Now in Psalm 132, verses 13 through 14, the Lord reveals the reason he's making this promise. He reveals that he is making this promise because he decided to. He decided that he would reign in Jerusalem as the sovereign God of the universe, and he wanted his king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem. We don't have God's motivation for choosing Jerusalem. We don't have God's reason exactly for this. Now, there's all geographic and political things that are a part of that. We don't know why God chose Israel. We don't know why God chose Jerusalem in his infinite, eternal understanding of the cosmos. But we know God said, I'm doing this. This is what I want. Therefore, I'm making these promises, and there's these conditions on this promise. We also know, as I alluded to before, that the people of Israel didn't keep their side of God's covenant. The kings didn't righteously serve and rule over the kingdom. And eventually, God removed them from the kingdom, removed them from the land. And as I said before, this psalm was probably sung during the time after the people come back into Jerusalem. After God brings them back, there's no Davidic king on the throne. And think on that for a second. God said a king would rule forever. And you've got to keep these conditions. And so these people are singing, these faithful followers of the Lord are singing, saying, God, don't forget. God, don't forget your promise. But they're also singing about the more expansive part of God's promise here. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 and 13, we see that God promised to raise up one and establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And then in verse 16, God says, your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. So, like the psalmist, we realize there's more going on here than just David and David's sons. It's talking about Jesus. It's talking about the Messiah who will come and rule forever from Jerusalem. And so, like the psalmist, believers can be encouraged because God is faithful to keep his promises. And in the next passage, we're going to see that we can trust the Lord. So look at Psalm 132, verses 17 and 18. There I will make a horn grow for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but the crown he wears will be glorious. Now here the psalmist reveals how God is going to fulfill his promise. The psalmist knows and the singers know that the descendants of David are not sitting on the throne, but God promised that someone would sit on the throne forever. So here the psalmist helps us understand how God's going to square that hole. First, he's going to bring about his anointed one. His anointed one. The anointed one is translated Messiah. And on this side of the cross, we know the Messiah is Jesus of Nazareth. And the psalmist gives us three metaphors to describe this anointed one, this Messiah, this Jesus. First, he says that God will make a horn grow for David. The horn of an animal symbolizes the strength of that animal. The Hebrews thought to make a horn for someone would be to make them strong. So God says, I'm going to bring forth a strong, a powerful ruler of Israel. John the Baptist's dad said that this was fulfilled in his lifetime. In Luke chapter 1, verse 69, he praises the Lord and he says, God has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. So God says, I'll make a horn grow for the house of David. But he also says that he will prepare a lamp for my anointed one. In 2 Samuel chapter 2, verse 17, David's soldiers refer to him as the lamp of Israel. So while David's descendants didn't sit on the throne for many years after him, his line never died out. Someone from his line is going to sit on the throne of Israel. But also we see that there's a lamp in the tabernacle. If you go back and you study the tabernacle in the temple, there's a lamp in there, and it's lit all the time. And it symbolizes the presence of God. The presence of God is symbolized through this lamp. And so we have these two pictures, David being called the lamp, and this lamp representing the presence of God. And then we get to the Gospel of John. The Gospel writer writes this in chapter 1, verse 4. He says, "In him," that's Jesus, "was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, yet the darkness did not overcome it." And down in verse 10 he writes, "He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him." God's anointed one is the lamp of Israel. He is the presence of God in this world. So first we see God's going to make a horn, God's going to make a lamp, and his anointed one is going to wear a glorious crown. Now the crown symbolizes the rule of the Messiah. He is going to put to shame anyone who opposes him. Remember, he's a strong ruler. And so we see that Jesus is going to be the king, the strong, mighty king of Israel. And actually, if we go to the Gospels again, the angel Gabriel is talking to Mary about her son. And he reveals to her that he is going to be this strong ruler, this anointed one, this Messiah. He says, "He, your son, will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end." In Acts chapter 10, the Apostle Peter makes it clear Jesus is this anointed one. Jesus is the fulfillment of the promise made in Psalm 132. Jesus is the strong leader. He is the one who's going to come and rule over the nation of Israel and rule over the entire world and the cosmos. He will put down all who oppose him. He will rule. And we can be sure that Jesus is the Messiah who delivers us from sin. As we conclude our study, we can go back and remember David faithfully worshiped the Lord through the things that he did. We don't earn our salvation by doing stuff, but we worship the Lord by faithfully serving him and faithfully representing him in our community. We can know not only do we worship the Lord, we worship the Lord who keeps his promises. God promised that someone was going to come and rule and reign in majesty, glory, and power. And that someone is Jesus. And we can live our life knowing that God will keep his promises. God's made a promise to us. If we've come to faith in him, we can know that we will rule with Jesus forever. But we're not there yet. We still have responsibility on this earth. So I want you to consider this week. How can you intentionally worship the Lord through your actions, through how you serve others and what you do in the community? But also, how can you introduce someone to this king? Because this king is the only way someone can make it through this life and make it into eternity and rule with him forever. Only when they realize that we are sinners, that we are saved by grace through faith in Christ, can they ever get there. So we need to tell them. And we worship the Lord while we do it. See you next week.